What's good, y'all? Hope everybody's well. Welcome back to the Onyx Report, Black Masculinist news for the day. Yeah, trying to get it in before the weekend. Hope y'all are good, man. I didn't do a show last night. I went out and caught Top Gun Maverick, and it went a little longer than I thought it would. Not lengthwise. I think by the time I got to the theater and went to go do a couple things, got home, it was a little too late. But y'all check out Artisan right here on YouTube. Go to his channel, Artisan MC. He's doing a review of it. I was listening to the review and needed to come in and do my own show, but he's coming out of the theater responding to it. So if you haven't, if you've seen it or you don't care about spoilers, check out his review. I'm trying to decide if I want to do one myself, but it was enjoyable. Obviously, if you got issues with films that promote military or U.S. imperialism, it is what it is. That's a Top Gun movie. There's going to be another country, whether you know what country it is or isn't, and they're going to get attacked. So you just got to deal with that. But some of the narratives, some of the images, some of the stories as it relates to men are very important, especially since there's such a dearth of material that actually deals with men in a realistic way, in a humanistic way, and doesn't come at it with, this kind of questionable agenda, but actually does deal with how men relate and identify, even cross generations. I mean, one of the things I liked was how they dealt with men's relationships over time. So y'all check it out if you get a chance to. It is what it is. What's up, Freddie? What's going on, Tim? Just like to shout a few people out as I see y'all. Hope y'all are good. The other thing I wanted to kind of just hip you guys to, got some new merchandise on the horizon, a few things coming in. This is one of the first. You haven't checked it out, just put it out today. This is on the Institute for Black Male Studies website. So I did a show last week, I believe it was, and we were talking about NAGA. We were dealing with black folk and gun ownership and so on and so forth. And one of the articles we reviewed gave a quote from Frederick Douglass. And Douglass was saying in this quote that black folk must have the cartridge box, which is another word for bullets, the jury box, and the ballot, right, to protect them. And so I was moved by that. What's up, Dr. Thunder? Shout out to you, right? So I thought, you know what? Let me acknowledge that. So I decided to, do so. So if you're interested in this shirt, I'll put the link in the box. You can go to the Institute for Black Male Studies website, and you can actually see the various things there. If you haven't been in a while, it might be something you want to check out. So you got the shirts there, the Frederick Douglass shirts. We even got a Tommy Curry one. We got one like I have on right now over here. I am a Black Masculinist. So there's plenty of material. You can see the I am Black Masculinist hats. So feel free to check those out when you get a chance. Might be something there you want to check out. And like I said, I got a couple more in the pipeline. So I hope you guys are interested in checking it out. So today's show, we're dealing with, as you can see the title, BLM, Intersectional Feminism, and Limousine Revolutionaries, right? So just to be clear, we're not talking about anybody, just everybody who's ever been a part of Black Lives Matter. As usual, when I bring up BLM, I tend to talk about, I guess what they're referring to now is the global organization as it relates to the three founders, right? The Black queer women founders of the organization and what's become of it. But I've talked at length about how it started and its agenda, especially its agenda in relation to using Black male bodies as a footstool for its own advancement, and then baiting and switching the agenda to something that really mentions particularly heterosexual Black males last, if at all. If anything, heterosexual Black men are not even particularly welcome in the conversation, and that's even on an ideological level. And yet there's no problem ambulance chasing Black male death. And I find the two used in that way to be fairly hypocritical. So that being said, we've seen recently in the last number of months, but really in the last couple of years, what's been done with those resources. And for many of us, it just cemented what we knew was already happening. But before I dive in, I do want to talk about some of the terms to classify some of these various groups, most particularly these various groups of women that I refer to. And I've used some of these terms in the past, but I just want to clarify how they relate and how they should be used. So there's three terms that come to mind whenever I start talking about intersectional feminism. And intersectional feminism, basically, if you're not familiar, it's the branch of feminism that pretty much comes. It's really Black feminism. Really, it's a major branch of it, but it deals with the concept of intersectionality as created by Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 1980s, I believe 89. And one of the things she argued with intersectionalism is that Black women suffered in terms of race, class, sex, and gender. They suffered intersectionally, right, across different intersectional, kind of experiences. And that said, when she got to Black men, because out of that argument, right, there was this, it came out of this framework where Black women were saying, well, we're not like white women. We're women, but we're not like white women. So we, suffer from patriarchy, but not the way white women do. And we're not like Black men. We suffer from racism, but we're not Black men because they're still men and they're still privileged on the basis of their gender. So this is the basis for a lot of this logic. By the time you get to intersectionality, it tries to frame this out. Now, there are some feminists like Athena Matua that came to realize that through empirical study, it wasn't that Black men were privileged because of gender. If anything, they were hyper oppressed because of gender, meaning that they bear the brunt of the most visible and brazen forms of oppression, whether it's police brutality, police homicide, incarceration, homelessness, unemployment, so on and so forth. You can go down the list of the most important things that we generally talk about in a society, and Black men are on the receiving end of it to a greater extent than Black women. But this only happens when you look at it empirically. If you just do it in terms of feelings, in terms of personal experiences and anecdotes, you can make up whatever you want, which is one of the things that many of us in Black male studies argue that a lot of these intersectional feminists did. They made up their minds about it based on their own personal experiences, and they really kind of tap dance through any kind of empirical data, if that, right? So shout out to Marco for the support. Appreciate that. Make sure y'all like, share, subscribe, join, and donate. Support the channel if you will. You can also support the channel on Patreon. You can support the Institute for Black Male Studies and the Onyx Report at the same time with a monthly contribution available on Patreon, or you can go ahead and give us a super chat right here. There's also PayPal, Venmo. Y'all know the deal. It's on the screen. So make sure you support the channel so we can continue this, right? So anyway, that's what intersectional feminism basically deals with. And since the advent of intersectional feminism, what you've had is a whole generation of college-educated women that learned to identify Black men as one of their chief problems, right? Because Black men were patriarchs who enjoyed a privilege at the expense of their oppression, according to their ideological framework. Now, one of the reasons that Black male studies comes into existence in its more formal sense is because even though you had a dwindling number of Black men who, in many ways, were going to college, they were sitting in these classes, they were hearing this rhetoric, not backed by anything, not substantiated by any data, but that began to bleed into personal relationships, intimate relationships, faculty-student relationships, professional relationships. This basic, almost religious belief that Black men were oppressing Black women, and some even argued killing Black women in mass, it really began to spur on an antagonism that was already existent in the Black community. What we call the gender war goes back decades. I mean, I told you guys I was looking through some of Orlando Patterson's work in the 90s, and he was quoting gender war issues in the 1960s. So this has been going on for generations. But I would argue that some of this intersectional feminism began to fan the flames on a whole nother level. And it gave an almost religious ideological framework to these feminists to justify their ideas that Black men were the problem. And they were teaching this in professional settings. They were teaching this in mainstream media. They were teaching this in classrooms. You didn't have to take a women's studies class. You could take an Africana studies class. You could take a class that was required to graduate, even at the graduate level. And you still had to deal with these ideas. And if that's not something you've been trained to deal with, you're just taking a class to graduate, they have an impact. And so this is where intersectional feminism becomes a problem, because it's been ordained by acceptable, established institutions. You have to engage it on one level or another as in the culture, whether you're talking about anything from nonprofit culture to getting grants. I mean, it's embedded in the culture of accessing certain types of resources. If you want to build an organization, if you want to get funding, so on and so forth, it's become a part of mainstream culture as it relates to Black America and activism. And BLM became one of the arms of that. It was the embodiment of an intersectional idea. And they so pushed that agenda that they were it was something that many Black men reported in their meetings when they tried to attend and join the organization. They were told they couldn't take a leadership role. They couldn't, if anything, they were on a timer for how long they could even speak in organizational meetings. One of the meetings I went to, they had on the wall, one diva, one mic. Now, how many heterosexual Black men identify themselves as divas? We weren't even part of the discussion, and you weren't supposed to be. I've literally watched them walk men out of the room. But they didn't have any problem using Black male deaths, especially Black males that they knew were heterosexual. They didn't have no problem with it. Right? It was an interesting dichotomy. But nevertheless, the three ways I kind of talk about, it's technically four ways I kind of, refer to women in this particular broadcast, Black women. You have the first branch, which are the Black feminist nationalists. And these are your Brittany Coopers, right? These are the founders of BLM, most particularly your Patrisse Cullors, right? These are the hardcore Black feminists who fundamentally believe that Black men are lesser beings. And of course, the bane of their existence, right? This is one of the reasons that BLM only recently pulled, their attack on the Black nuclear family off their website. Because for the most part, the way they identified the desirable family structure that they thought would be best for Black America was pretty much absent heterosexual Black men, right? So this is the dynamic. So I consider those Black feminist nationalists. They were your Bell Hookses, your Barbara Smiths. They were your Kimberly Crenshaws back in the day. These were an obscure group of Black feminists in the 70s and 80s that beget ideological daughters and granddaughters that ended up with BLM and continues on to this day, which are Brittany Coopers. This is a multi-generational ideological feminist family that builds itself off of misandry, the hatred of Black men, anti-Black misandry to be specific, because the hatred of Black men is not the same as the hatred of men in general. This is why we have the term anti-Black misandry. This is why, as Black male studies scholars, we have to frame what that means, because there is a distinct history in this culture, in this country, of hating Black men. Of course, going back to slavery, going back to depictions of Africa as the land of savagery. That savagery remained attached to the Black male idea through slavery and onward. It has a very distinct history. It isn't arbitrary. This is why my relationship with the white manosphere and the Black manosphere, I'm very particular, because I don't want this shit to be watered down to some generic idea about how all men are hated. All men in the West deal with various branches, various levels of misandry. I do believe that, institutionally even. But anti-Black misandry has its own unique history, and I don't conflate the two. Now, Black feminist nationalists, especially when you look at the works of Dr. Tommy Curry, when he talks about subculture of violence theory, he talks about the ways in which Black feminists in the 70s and 80s, most particularly, began to quote from racist white scholars. And they use those quotes to frame their idea of Black men. Now, much of that white scholarship was racist in its basis, and it did not use any empirical data to come to its conclusions that Black men were the embodiment of the boogeyman, right? We were the living embodiment of every negative idea. And by the time you get to the rise of toxic masculinity, even though those who framed the idea didn't necessarily identify Black men as such, Black men become part and parcel to it. And so Black feminism, most particularly intersectional feminism, takes this idea and runs with it. This is why you have a Brittany Cooper who can associate Black men with the Buffalo shooter, even though we actually commit mass murder to the smallest degree. Right? If you haven't seen that, if you missed some of the recent shows, you can go right here to YouTube to my community tab, and you can see the post I left citing Dr. Tommy Curry, clarifying where that data comes from and what it looks like. Shout out to Soul Sir Fiverr says, it's like you said before, good doctor, we have to save ourselves. No one's coming to save us. Indeed. Shout out to Joe Herb. Appreciate that support. Fragrance Place. Appreciate that. Thank you. Ghetto User. Appreciate that support, man. Support the scholar. Thank you. Please make sure you do. Right. So Black feminist nationalists are the intellectual, ideological arm. These are the technically they're, the theorists, the theoreticians of the group. Right. They've been pushing these ideas out for 50 years. And it really, I keep going back to Oprah, because Oprah was the spigot that opened that up to the world, to mainstream America. She took this obscure group of feminists, from Mindesaki Shange to, Michelle Wallace, to Bell Hooks, to Terry McMillan. She actually took a couple of, ideological generations of Black feminists, intersectional feminists, and broadcast them to the world. And Black men were on the pyre. We were what was sacrificed for them to introduce a new global narrative of being oppressed by Black men. See, prior to that, especially during the Civil Rights Movement, you had the idea of the Black community as a homogenous entity, where Black folk as a group were oppressed. You look at the Civil Rights Movement, whether you like it, love it, hate it, whatever, you had a movement of men, women, across class, across sexuality, across color, across hair texture, all saying we're being mistreated. We need policy to advocate for us. Now, again, you can disagree with all kinds of elements of the civil rights movement, but at least you had that. Afterwards, however, most particularly moving from the 80s to the 2000s and the 2010s, you had a very different Black movement. It was a movement that was predicated on identity. It was predicated on intersectionality. And for the most part, identified heterosexual Black males to be one of the biggest threats, almost on par with white supremacy, as far as they were concerned. And so when Black men began to actually look at the data, look at the history, look at the reports, look at the studies, look at the charts, and we started to identify, well, the way Black women are being used, they're being paid as colonial agents, which I'll talk about in a second. It's actually the other way around, if anything. So we got labeled as just a knee-jerk reaction to feminism. So this is why you hear some people stand up and say, well, we got to do things right, and we got to advocate for the Black community, and we don't want extremism in any form, which to me is a ridiculous answer, because really all it really comes down to is we have a culture where we don't hold women accountable. And so if we can jump into a quote unquote gender war and say, well, both sides are being extreme, let's just calm down. That's another way of not having to do that, because Black men have been held accountable for at least 50 years, but even though it's much longer, there's not been a time during my lifetime that I know of where Black men were not considered boogeymen by the larger society or Black America. Black men have always been held accountable, whether we liked it or not, whether we agreed with it or not, or whether it was true or not. We were still held accountable. Black women, not so much. And most particularly these feminists, these theoreticians of misandry, they don't get held accountable. And so even when you have people that want to step in for the good of the community to resolve these tensions and arguments, and of course we saw this after the death of Kevin Samuels, nobody wants to take seriously what both the Black manosphere and Black male studies scholars are pointing out. They want to conveniently dismiss it as reverse feminism so they don't have to hear it. And at the end of the day, women don't get held accountable. So men get thrown on the cross to be sacrificed. Women, at best, if they're acknowledged at all, get a slap on the hand. We keep it moving. But here's my thing: if we don't address the deep-seated misandry toward Black men, that Black men across ideology, across class, across color, across industry, across occupation can talk about. I can have conversations with hardcore Black revolutionaries, conservatives, Democrats, liberals. I can talk to Black men from any camp you want to. And if the conversation goes on long enough, especially if I get some liquor in them, you'll start to hear the same fucking stories. Stories where institutions are used at the behest of the Black women in their lives. This is not an attack on Black women because I got some kind of problem. This is a systemic and structured way of undermining what was at one point a collective community that saw itself as an entity in and of itself. They saw itself, the community saw itself as such. And one of the ways that was undermined was to actually split the dynamic from within. And the Faustian bargain wasn't something that black men signed. We weren't offered a Faustian bargain. We were sent to jail. We had the war on drugs. We were indicted. We were under attack. And there's reasons for that. It's why we talk about Jim Sedanius so much over here. It's why we talk about Errol Miller so much over here. It's why we talk about Anthony Lamell over here, black scholars, Robert Staples, brothers who've been pointing this out for decades. Black women were offered a different institutional relationship with the state, with philanthropic dollars, with the corporate entity. They were offered a different relationship. They were offered middle class access. Now, the reality, of course, is many of them got jobs, white collar jobs. Many of them got degrees. But when you actually look at net worth, they really got a lot of debt. But they were entitled on the basis of how it appeared. See, they could distance themselves from black men, particularly poor black men, on the surface, even though in reality, it wasn't much different. I mean, the average brother working construction is probably pretty much better off than the average college graduate with over $70,000 worth of school loan debt. And trust me when I tell you, you don't have to work hard to get over $70,000 in school loan debt. You really don't. What's up, IDP Expressions? Appreciate that support. AKs and Curtains, thank you. Tim Howard, always appreciating that support, man. All right. So this is what we're dealing with. So the first group I talk about is Black feminist nationalists. They are the theoretical end, the intellectual end that kind of sets the direction for this misandry. And then you have what I call colonizing agents. Now, colonizing agents are your typical everyday black women. Shout out to H. Taylor for the Cash App. And these are the women that may not have ever really set any purposeful agenda against black men the way black feminist nationalists tend to, but they are lured by job access, by education, by whatever, and they kind of internalize the ideas associated with that. This is the Faustian bargain. Deal with the devil. You can have these things. You can have this access, but you have to see, your superiority over these men. These men are a problem. These men are something you have to tolerate. They're great for sperm, maybe occasional interaction. Maybe you can even get protection out of them. You may even marry one here or there, but don't fundamentally let go of the idea that you are actually better than your men. And these are the colonizing agents. They are larger in number than black feminist nationalists. They are the white collar brigade. The bachelor's, master's degree, even PhD degree having women that fundamentally have internalized this misandrous feminist idea, but in a much more subtle way. They're not ideologues. They're not rhetoricians. They can't break down the theory to you the way black feminist nationalists like Brittany Cooper can. But they act on these ideas. These are the women that'll come to you and say, well, I'm looking for a partner. I'm looking for a Jay-Z to my Beyonce. I want to be a power couple. I want to be a millionaire. These are your Rebecca Lynn Popes. She starts talking about, women are running circles around men, but provides no data. That's the colonizing agent. Even if they mean well, they can actually love you, but still implement an agenda that's fundamentally misandric, and they don't even know it. They will raise sons with a disdain and not even know it. I've talked about this repeatedly because this is how they're socialized. These are the young women when they were kids that were trained to go to school and may have had brothers who were either ignored or pampered by mothers who were terrified of what the system might do to their sons. But the girls were prepared for leadership. The girls went to school. The girls graduated and went to college. They got white collar jobs. These are your colonizing agents. The last group, I should say the second to last, because I'm going to add a fourth one, but I'm not going to go as much in depth. They're the womanists. Now, I don't mean those who call themselves womanists, because that varies. You got some that do it and they don't sound any different than the feminists. But when you really look at womanism in and of itself, it differentiated itself. And go to the Green Gorilla channel, because he posted a lot of these lectures from Brenda Werner, to a number of others that really made it clear that they had serious issues with black feminism. They didn't see themselves as women, as individual women separate from everything else that had to suffer patriarchy. Many of these women actually argued that, if anything, that their identity was tied to black families. They didn't differentiate themselves from their men. There's a quote I use. There's actually not a quote. It's a video clip I use in my classes of Yvette Carnell. Now, she, to my knowledge, has never called herself a womanist, but this particular clip is very womanist in its orientation. Maybe I'll post it, after this, just on its own for you to see. But one thing she talks about is she says no to white women. I'm not going to call myself a feminist and disassociate from my brothers. She said, at the end of the day, especially when you're talking about wealth being transferred within a family, my brother doesn't get shit over me that I don't get because we black, we're poor, we got 2% of the national wealth. Ain't no reason to do so, and she argues he's not the source of the oppression that comes to me. Right? That's a womanist position. They didn't see themselves as feminists. They saw themselves as part of the black family, and they identified the way feminism worked against them. Now, the thing about womanism, though, in my humble experience, when I would attend National Council for Black Studies conferences, those women were in deep. And if you were a black feminist going to an NCBS conference, you were going to get your ass whooped. But something changed. The numbers changed. The whole culture of it changed in many respects. The feminism element ramped up. The womanism element ramped down. Then womanism kind of became this real esoteric, partially spiritual kind of framework where those who identified as womanists really would only talk about, womanhood in some kind of mystical fashion, but they did not have the same kind of fire that they used to have. Feminists kind of took over. It was what it was. But anyway, the last group I'll call is almost kind of gender agnostics. They're just kind of, these are your everyday black women who've never read a feminist text, who may, or may not have, grappled with some of the ideas they've internalized from media, but aren't attached to them at all. And if anything, don't even want to get involved in a lot of this drama. Right. But at the end of the day, those are the four groups I talk about. And in this particular video, as we're looking at BLM, we're looking at how they're treated. These are primarily black feminist nationalists. And I would go further to say, when you look at Patrisse Cullors in particular, it's a very distinct camp. I never actually thought about this until, a little while ago. I was talking to BGS and I said something. He said, man, you got to talk about that. I said, there's a very distinct camp of black feminist nationalists that is fairly new on the scene. And they're what I call limousine revolutionaries. Limousine revolutionaries, right? They have all the revolutionary rhetoric. They're talking about Marxism, so on and so forth. They're talking about bringing the system down and confronting three-letter organizations, confronting the state, dealing with patriarchy and racism and all of that. Put $5 in their pocket, and what do? Eventually, start buying mansions, passing the money around to their friends and family, only funding branches of BLM where you have queer leadership, and leaving out those that were actually led by black men, heterosexual black men at that, leaving them out in the cold. And if anything, not even identifying those branches as part of the BLM network, to the point where many of those brothers either had to stay in and use the name in isolation or change the name entirely and try to find new ways to group with other people to keep that grassroots campaign going. Because after all, we look at the death of Michael Brown, that's what it started out as, a grassroots collective of black folk. BLM kind of came in and hijacked it on social media. So by the time you get whites starting to contribute to it, they contribute to what they hear about. And BLM was all they heard. And so now you have this limousine revolutionary, Patrisse Cullors, and her ilk, who get to make decisions about millions, and some argue billions of dollars that could have been helpful to grassroots organizations, could have been helpful to kids, could have been helpful to different demographics in the community that could have used those resources to survive, if nothing else. Instead, they went to fucking mansions. What? Don't listen to me. So, this is Erica Lachey. I've never met her, but she and I actually were in Tariq Nasheed's documentary on black men that came out a couple years ago. And she had some words to say about this. See if we can check her out.
You know what's wild to me? On the heels of a terrorist hate crime, we have black people saying that black men have been radicalized because they're still showing love to Kevin Samuels. I want to tell y'all a story I read about trees. The trees needed a spokesperson for the forest, and the axe came along and said that he could be the one to do that. Now, even though he wasn't exactly like the trees still trusted the axe because he was made from the same wood that they were. So when the axe got in power, more trees disappeared, but they never suspected the axe because he was made from the same wood that they were. It's a lot of people with influence that perpetuate this boogeyman stereotype about our men, a lot of Black people that encourage us to vote for the same party with no tangibles, and Black women who've become very wealthy from the death of Black men. It's time we start calling y'all the axes and the sellouts that you are. You do not deserve to speak on our behalf because you are our enemy. You know what's wild to me?
I'm always horrible about catching it before Instagram or TikTok replays the shit. But yeah, what she's basically talking about, just calling out these limousine revolutionaries for what they are. Shout out to Electrician 480. Appreciate that support. What's up, Afro Nerd? Indigo Flow in the house. Right? Hybrid. What's going on? Yeah, she's calling them out. And that's actually a very womanist position. Again, I don't know Erica Lachey. I don't follow her to a great extent. I've heard a couple of videos. I remember some inconsistencies at one point, but I'll say this. I treat people on a moment-to-moment basis based on what they do. So in other words, if you hear me cite somebody or you see me play a clip of somebody, that doesn't mean I'm advocating for everything they've done or said. I'm advocating, or at least acknowledging, what they've said in the moment I played them. Has nothing to do with whether or not I endorse their entire platform. None of that. In the moment I'm talking about, when I play something that I'm playing, I'm addressing it in the terms I want to address it in. Now, her statements there speak to the exploitation of Black men by some of these limousine revolutionaries. And she called them out. That's a womanist position. And shout out to her for saying so. That isn't a given anymore. Like one might argue it might have been at a different point in time. And there are people that look to exploit for their own profit. So I am aware of that. But I think regardless of what some people's motivations were in that given moment, what she said is true, it's true. And I treat it as such. And it was. Right? Now, the truth can also come from very strange places. They don't even have to be places you entirely agree with. Some of you guys are familiar with, the next person I'm going to play. I'm not necessarily a fan of her work. But at the end of the day, if something's right, it's right. So let's check out what one Candace Owens had to say. Some of you guys have already seen this, but I want to play it for posterity.
I just want to take you through Patrisse Cullors' real estate empire that she's been building in the background of the Black Lives Matter movement. Okay, so she spent $3.2 million on high-end homes between 2016 and 2021 at the peak of the movement. In 2016, she bought a home in Inglewood, California for $510,000. In 2018, she purchased a $590,000 home in South Los Angeles. In January, she purchased a $415,000 custom ranch in Conyers, Georgia, which features a private airplane hangar. That sounds nice. In 2021, she purchased a $1.4 million home in exclusive Los Angeles neighborhood of Topanga Canyon. That's the one that I was at. In 2022, they spent nearly $6 million. This is the organization directly in their donations to purchase a 6,500 square foot California mansion. And they made the purchase through an intermediary named Dwayne Pascal, who is the financial manager for an LLC owned by Black Lives Matter co-founder Patrisse Cullors and her wife.
All right. So y'all see, right? She lays it out there. And of course, one of the big clips that many of us saw in the last couple of weeks is when she actually approached Cullors' residence. Hold on. She approached Cullors' residence at one point in time and brought cameras. She said she was working on a documentary. And of course, Patrisse Cullors blew it up as if she was being attacked. But, Candace laid out the camera work. She played the video. She played the video sitting out in front of the mansion. She said, no, we knocked on the door, asked security if we could interview him, left when we were asked to leave. And, we see this performance on social media from Patrisse Cullors. But Cullors goes even further because in the weeks since that's happened, it's of course, gone public in terms of how a lot of the resources were spent. millions going to friends, baby fathers or baby daddies, and associates, family, so on and so forth. So not just mansions, but also to family and friends for specific purposes, right? Well, she put out recently on May 18th another statement, and you can find this on the New York Post. BLM co-founder Patrisse Cullors says her mistakes with white guilt money were weaponized against her. Now, let me be clear. White guilt money, maybe, but I don't frame it just as that. Sure, white liberal guilt plays a lot in terms of how these resources come about, but more than that. And I agree with some of the people grassroots activists who have said this does damage to organizations that are doing some genuine work and really could have used these resources to actually help people. Not only people in general, but families of those who lost family members, to police violence, to vigilante violence. All of those resources could have been useful. But I'm not going to just dismiss this shit as white guilt money. The first time I saw the $6 million mansion in LA, where I'm watching these limousine revolutionaries sip wine from a table with a white tablecloth, sitting in luxury, talking about this is a refuge for activists, some bullshit. My first response, my first feeling was that's blood money. But I don't mean blood money in the typical way that term's used. That is the blood of Black men, most especially. Now, I'm not saying Black men were the only ones that have died, whose deaths have spurred the activists to reach a whole new crescendo in the last few years, but it is the overwhelming majority. The overwhelming majority of the blood spilt that created a whole new wave of activism came at the cost of Black male life more than any other demographic. Black men laid the symbolic groundwork for this. Black men were the sacrificial sheep that created a whole new economy around, both guilt and whatever else, racism, white supremacy, you name it. But at the end of the day, this wasn't just white guilt money. This was the lives and deaths and blood of Black men that was appropriated and used. And we know, if you ever watch Pocket Watching with JT, shout out to Pocket Watching. I enjoy his show. Good work. Very detailed, very, very empirical. And as a tax man, I think an accountant, I don't know his official title. One of the things he did recently, he went in and actually pulled the paperwork for BLM and their organizational structure and how their monies were spent based on tax filings. One of the things he found was that Patrisse Cullors herself was the only one in a decision-making position. Well, she had a 3-person council. She was the only one that had voting power as to what happened with those resources. So again, I'm not letting her just dismiss this as white guilt money. That was blood. That was Black male blood. And I want to be clear about that. But going into this article, right, BLM co-founder Patrisse Cullors said that when $90 million in white guilt money came pouring into the organization's coffers after the murder of George Floyd, the group had no infrastructure in place to handle the flood of cash, and now the mistakes are being weaponized against her. Bullshit. They're not being weaponized against you. You made poor decisions. You didn't let anybody else make decisions. You excluded Black men from even having a voice in the organization, and you prioritized your friends, family, and those who shared your ideology. And that was it. That's not having your mistakes weaponized. That's making fucking mistakes that cause the downfall of this. And it's going to end up hurting a lot of organizations. And I'm not anti-organization by any means. There are organizations that are doing good work on the ground, trying to help people, but often doing so with pennies. And it's almost unheard of to see this kind of wave of resources come at, especially a grassroots thing, or at least what was supposed to be. She didn't share it with none of them. So I'm not going to, this little, no, this is some bullshit. And to be clear, there were more millions that came prior to the death of George Floyd. Many of us stopped really hearing from BLM at the election of, Donald Trump. That's one of the things I remember. When Donald started threatening to take people to jail for shutting down freeways, that was the last time I heard of BLM until the death of George Floyd. A lot of people didn't know where else to go with their ire, with their frustration. So where did they go? They went to what they knew of. They went to what they'd heard of. BLM. In my assessment, it reinvigorated BLM, even though BLM was really falling apart. I think that's what's actually underneath what she's saying in this first paragraph, that they weren't prepared. They didn't have the infrastructure. They thought it was over. I met BLM activists who 8 months after, Michael Brown's death were talking about, people don't show up at our protests anywhere near as much as they did some months ago. So by the time you get to just before George Floyd, nobody was talking about BLM. But when the shit hit the fan, people went to what they knew. And that was what that was. She says, I'm a human being that has made mistakes, that wants to change, wants to challenge those mistakes, and wants to learn from those mistakes. And I think what's been hard is feeling like there isn't room and space for that. Part of the reason there isn't room and space for that is it's very rare. It's very rare to actually see Black grassroots organizations in a position to command so much attention and have a series of events that justifies their existence on a scale that's global. And this is what, again, made the civil rights movement so important, because it had global access. International media were going down to the South and getting video clips of people being attacked by dogs on, police leashes. That had global impact. That's not a frequent thing. It's not a frequent thing, especially from a community that owns very little, had little stake in media, has very little control, very little power. Because if we had it, we would have produced new movements every 10 years that had global impact. We couldn't control that. So it's a rarity when it happens. And of course, you're going to be blackballed as a leader. But at the end of the day, you don't fucking help. I mean, look what I talked about a few days ago with Dr. Martin Luther King, where you have even young Black women talking about him as nothing more than just a man who cheated on his wife. Right? Data coming out of so-called data, right? Coming out of the FBI under Hoover. COINTELPRO tactics, right? And empirically, there's very little we can find that King did that was highly problematic. Very little to anything. And he was still maligned. What the fuck do you think is going to happen when you buying mansions with blood money? And now you want to come out here and say you're being attacked. The beleaguered former executive director of the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation also addressed allegations that she had personally benefited from the donations by purchasing homes for herself, including a $6 million property in LA, which included a 7-bedroom mansion, a pool, a soundstage, and a garden, which she threw parties at. This was an investment. It's not my personal real estate. It's not Patrisse Cullors' real estate. It's the organization's real estate. First of all, it's bullshit. You're splitting hairs. Shout out to Ima. Appreciate the support. She says, as an ex-gangster, the pro-black black women I date. Oh, I'm sorry. Ima, I guess, is a brother. I sorry about that. Maybe I'm mispronouncing it. It says I'm a Z, I guess. Okay, I misunderstood what that is. Anyway, as an ex-gangster, the pro-black black women I dated was just street chicks with head wraps with no game. These chicks usually was knocked up early by the homies. Huh? I can't say I ain't seen that. Shout out to Arta Idmore. What's going on with you? Hope you're well. All right, BGS in the house. Excellent conversation between BGS and Green Gorilla. If you haven't checked it out, please make sure you go to the Green Gorilla channel after this and check it out. Very important discussion. Interesting all the way through. So make sure you support. Right. Color said the house was to be used as a media creation space for BLM and also as a safe house for activists. But she said the organization decided to stay mum about the true purpose of the mansion out of fear that the right-wing media would jeopardize the safety of those associated with the movement. The minute we shared the information with the public, the right-wing media would do what they always do, and they always did, she said, because the right-wing media doesn't have any sense or care of people's security or safety. You know, I used to work in Nickerson Gardens when I was an undergrad. I worked in LA. I worked in various parts of South Central. I worked in Compton. I went to Cal State Dominguez. If you've never been there, it sits right next to Compton. You walk down the street, it's Compton. Carson and Compton are just right next to each other. And I worked in Nickerson Gardens. I worked for a nonprofit there. And at the end of the day, I met kids who had never been to the beach. And not just kids. Shit, I met people in their late 20s, early 30s who were living in Compton, living in Nickerson Gardens, living in South Central, who'd never been to the beach, which, if you've been to LA, it ain't that far, provided you avoid traffic. But that said, to grow up in these spaces and never even be able to go to some of the places that are publicly accessible, that people travel all around the world to come to LA to go to, speaks to what a lot of the people are dealing with there. So if you're going to end up having a mansion that's supposed to be some type of benefit to at least the community, or I guess it's to the organization and not the community, either way, wasn't nobody benefiting from this shit. That's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Color's interview was uploaded the same day it was reported by the Post that rapper and entrepreneur Damon Turner, the father of the youngest child, had paid almost 5 times the amount BLM paid to the Trayvon Martin Foundation. According to the group's latest filing with the IRS, Colors paid Turner's company $969,459,000 for production, design, and media services in fiscal year 2020. Almost $1 million. An additional $840,000 went to a security company owned by Color's brother. Right? Colors resigned from the organization a month after the Post revealed that she went on a $3.2 million real estate buying spree. Colors denied that the money used to buy residential properties in Georgia and California came from the charity, and those properties do not show up in the filing. Right. Black Lives Matter was founded by Colors, Alicia Garza, and Ayo Tamedi in 2013 as a charity honoring the memory of Martin, the unarmed black teen who was killed by George Zimmerman in 2012. By 2020, Colors was the only remaining co-founder still attached to the organization. Now, here's the thing. We're going to talk about these resources. We're going to talk about what's come through there. I'm just curious. What is the state of many black men, especially post-pandemic? I mean, since, of course, even as they point out here, this is all predicated on the death of Martin, right? Of course, followed up very quickly by Brown. So Trayvon, Michael, they're the basis of this, right? And then, of course, George. I mean, really, you can track the expansion of BLM just off the deaths of 3 black men. And that's not to say they were the only deaths. Those were just the major tent poles that lifted the organization's notoriety, right? Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, George Floyd, right? Men whose deaths on one level or another, to some extent, in one way or another, the deaths were captured on camera in some kind of way, shape, or form. With Trayvon, you actually heard it. I don't know how many of you bothered, to listen or did listen. You could actually hear the altercation take place when someone was calling 911. And then immediately after, you started to see pictures circulating on the internet of him dead, laying there in the street. Of course, Michael Brown the same. With George Floyd, we actually witnessed the whole thing. And he wasn't the only one, but those are the 3 major tent poles. But let's look at the state of black men in general. This is a piece you can find on Atlanta Black Star, and I'll include all the links in the description when I'm done with the video. Give me a few minutes after I'm done to post it. All right. This comes out May 22nd, AtlantaBlackStar.com. The consequences of historical discrimination. Report shows black men are left out of economic recovery from the pandemic. Shout out to The Threshold. Appreciate that support. So we need you and appreciate you. Thank you for feeding us. Keep the party going, sir. Much appreciated. Thank you. And if for any reason I missed your super chat, I apologize. Anyway, so it reads, although the nation has shown signs of a resurrection from the economic downfall caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, black men in America are stuck in a permanent recession, stifled by the impact of systemic racism, a recent report shows. According to the Center for American Progress, report published in late March, black men have continued to see persistent unemployment gaps, even after a reported nationwide economic turn. The contagious disease crippled the economy as businesses were shuttered to contain its spread in the early months of the outbreak. The shutdowns had the biggest impact on the paychecks of low-wage workers, many of them minorities, data show. The low-paying jobs provided little access to benefits or opportunities to save. Even as the public health experts learned how to contain the disease and the federal government pumped historic amounts of aid into state coffers for recovery, black men were still left out of the workforce, the report shows. An economy where black men consistently experience significantly higher unemployment rates than white men cannot be considered as having reached full employment, the report reads. From the time the U.S. Department of Labor started tracking labor numbers, Black men have experienced unemployment twice as much as white men. The report shows the employment and economic gap between Black men and white men has never closed, CAP researchers contend. In 2020, Black men earned just 75 cents for every dollar earned by white men. And there's a lot of data in this. We've been talking about this for years over here on the Onyx Report. I brought in scholars. I've cited data. Basically, as it pertains to that, 75 cents is new. I mean, prior to that, it was about 69 cents. And those were for employed Black men, which meant that when you factored in incarceration, it dropped down to about 51 cents as of a few years ago. And that 51 cents put Black men under Black women in terms of income, wealth. Right? When you factor in incarceration, when you factor in unemployment, Black men are the only group that has earned less in terms of wealth. But when you look at the BLS data, as far as employed Black men, what you find is Black men earn more from age 18 to 65. So the data is kind of shows us a number of things at the same time. And the way I like to frame it is Black men are doing better and worse than their own women, let alone other groups. Right? But the better is in spite of the institutions that don't support them. And the worse is due to the institutional practices that undermine them. And this is what this article is basically dealing with, only in the context of employment. So Black men are doing far better than they have any business doing based on what they're up against. But continuing on, researchers attributed the racial disparity to a pattern of racial discrimination, overrepresentation in the criminal justice system, unfair employment practices and policies, and a lack of economic opportunity. The report says it has created a social crisis among many Black communities, and it made it harder for Black men to weather the national recession. There's also, just to let you know, another article that came out the other day that highlighted that Black and Asian men tend to find, or Blacks and Asians tend to find themselves supervised and followed around at work to a greater extent than any other group. Let me see. I post a lot of stuff, so I'm not sure. There it is. Hold on. Yeah, Black and Asian workers more likely to be monitored at work than white people. Right. So just to let you know, this stuff is happening. Right? Whether we are just really seeing the consequences of historical discrimination, Rose Guitar, one of the authors of the study, told Atlanta Black Star, those types of systemic issues, they take time and you have to be conscious of them. See, this is one of the things I was saying even before the pandemic hit its full stride. And that was that the more we went into the pandemic, the more it was framed around women, around poverty, around women who were poor, around women who weren't getting access and keeping employment and couldn't find places to live. And of course, all of that is only continued. But what a lot of people ignored was that the majority of the Black homeless were men. The majority of the Black unemployed were men before we went into the pandemic. This article is one of only a couple of articles in the last couple of years that even talks about Black men explicitly. Most of it has just been nebulous statements about Blackness, about women, but they've tap danced around Black men as a specific group. So whether you're talking about deaths from COVID, whether you're talking about unemployment, whether you're talking about housing access, whether you're talking about any of those any of those issues, you'll find very few reports that explicitly outline Black males. Because if they do, it really the numbers downplay the groups they would prefer to talk about. Right? Anyway. 361 watching. Like, share, subscribe, join, and donate if you will. Support the channel. Shout out to Bill Reed. Appreciate that support. So salute, Doc. Thank you for the continuing scholarly approach. We appreciate how you move. And I appreciate your appreciation. That's it. Put it out there. But let's continue. As of April, the national unemployment rate was 3.6, 1 percentage point above pre-pandemic levels. 2 years before, in April 2020, the national unemployment rate was 14.7%, and more than 17 million more people were unemployed. The unemployment rate was 12.3% among white men, while Black men's unemployment rate soared higher than the national level, and so far to a rate unattainable by white men, 16%. But again, when you factor it by, it depends on how you look at the data, because, one of the major reports that came out a couple of years ago, again, pre-pandemic, was that in 35 major cities, unemployment for Black men was up between 40 and 50%. And recently, I've had some people identify in their cities that it went higher than that. But very little conversation about this. And again, if that's happening prior to the pandemic, what the fuck do you think took place in the pandemic? So we had a whole conversation about a she session. We have yet to have a conversation about what happened to Black men. Right? At the end of 2021, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell said the labor market was hotter than before the pandemic as the white men glided back into the workforce with an unemployment rate at 3%. Black men were more than twice as likely to be unemployed. Leroy Hicks, 32, Black man who lives in LA, said he felt optimistic about his economic status before the pandemic. Hicks has worked multiple jobs, odd jobs for the past 6 years, and before the pandemic had a steady stream of income from his jobs as a bouncer, campaign organizer, and culinary worker. But most of the jobs were put on hold while scientists tried to control the national outbreak. So you got pictures, and again, I'll put the link in here, but I just kind of wanted to cover the major parts of the data. Let me just jump to the end here, and feel free to read the rest of the article when I post it in the description. Indigo, appreciate that support. Just doing what I can to support as always. Appreciate you, Doc. Scholars, appreciate you, man. Researchers said older Black men have to overcome not only racism, but also ageism. Older Black men tend to have less access to retirement benefits, causing many to stay in the labor force, the pool of workers, for longer. There was a 7.6% increase in the number of older Black men in the labor force in 2021. The report also shows that Black workers in the South received less supplemental unemployment benefits from the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act of 2020. CAP researchers said state, local, and federal agencies should collaborate and push policies and programs to increase the number of Black men in the workforce and narrow the nation's racial wealth and unemployment gap. The United States has a moral obligation to eliminate barriers that have kept too many Black men from fully participating in the workforce and economy, CAP researchers wrote. For generations, these barriers have taken a devastating toll on Black families and communities, hindering their economic growth and prosperity. Now, when you place what took place with Patrisse Cullors and BLM and this gross misuse of millions of dollars, and you put it in the context of Black men who can barely find employment after the pandemic is officially considered over, at a time where companies and employers claim they're looking for workers, those who have the capacity, the experience, and even the training and documentation, certification to perform those jobs. If they're Black and they're male, still finding themselves on the outside. When you put BLM's, exploited practices, especially considering that blood money came from the death of Black males, when you put it in the context of Black male lack of employment post-pandemic, it's even more gross and frustrating. At least for me. That's the way I see shit. It wasn't just an isolated incident, because we ain't talked about the millions that they got before George Floyd's death either. Some argue that went up into the billions. Between Michael Brown's death and just before George Floyd, there are many that argued that there were billions in place. Notice these articles are only talking about post-George Floyd, which is problematic enough, because even members of the organization are waiting to find out where the money went. Not much transparency from what I understand. But, the question also can be extended to a whole nother area. And this one, I'm not going to go through the whole report, but I think just the beginning information is enough. This is another article on Atlanta Black Star. Just about all of our land. Report shows Black farmers lost $326 billion worth of land from dispossession and discriminatory practices. According to the report published on May 5th, after slavery, 425,000 Black families had nearly 20 million acres of farmland in the South by 1910. They have since lost 14 million acres, often at the hands of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Land lost and the possible income the land could have produced for Black farmers between 1920 and 1997 totaled $326 billion. Now, again, it's all about context. So if we're talking about Black male unemployment at a time period where you got millions of dollars being given in the name of, killed Black men, and no addressing that whatsoever by the organization that has profited off the deaths of Black men, that's problematic. But even if you step back and look at it in terms of a communal, context in relation to land ownership, now one could argue, if you had no scruples whatsoever, that she purchased all these mansions to combat this lack of access to land. But, it tends to be people with few resources, but a lot of imagination that could have come up with ideas about how you could actually begin to purchase land in the name and put it in the names of people who would do something to it or with it that could actually contribute to the uplift of those at the very bottom. And again, most particularly, those Black males who are unemployed and whose deaths grab a lot of attention, especially when they're caught on camera, but their families don't benefit and other Black men that look like them don't benefit. So again, looking at the loss of billions of dollars worth of land for Black folk, there's a lot that you could do with even just under 100 million, let alone how much was already secured before that. It could have benefited a larger population of people. But where does this kind of exploitive sensibility come from? This idea, this entitled idea, and it doesn't end with colors. She's just the latest example. This limousine revolutionary dynamic where you have these professional, it's interesting because the professional component can come in different ways. It can be the white collar, wannabe boss bitch, or it can be the nonprofit, I think there was a term that a couple of sisters had introduced me to a few years ago, nonprofit industrial complex. And I've worked nonprofit before, Black nonprofit, majority female. A lot of brothers couldn't even get in that. They tend to work lower level positions. You often find they're working for women who run these nonprofits, and those nonprofits secure grants on a regular basis that a lot of times Black men have difficulty accessing. Same thing happened during the pandemic in terms of small business loans and supports. And, a lot of Black men, you guys know, I've talked about this. They actually had to find Black women to be the face of their organization just to get hold of some of these resources. So when you start talking about Black nonprofit, it's a majority female dynamic. Men find themselves on the lower end of the totem pole working odd jobs, especially if they have a prison record. Often the best they can do. But actually creating a 501c3, getting regular grant money enough to securely pay for employees on an annual basis, it's that much more difficult to do if you don't have a college degree, if you don't have relationships that allow you to establish this long term. Those kind of things tend to pop up and go down as soon as they came up. So we tend to find it's educated Black women that secure most of that when it comes to Black nonprofits. But that can be just as exploitive as what Patrisse Cullors is doing, right? But there's a kind of sensibility, I think, when it comes to this, that because of these institutional, opportunities that Black men in many ways weren't able to enjoy, Black men are perceived as the foot soldiers. And this doesn't take long to occur. This actually can start very young. And so I'm going to close with a video that many of you may have seen on social media, but nonetheless gives us an idea about where some of these early ideas come from. Let's see here.
Their goals were. This group of eighth grade girls, and I asked them to tell me what their goals were. This one particular young lady said that she wanted to have 2 kids. So I said, so are you going to have a husband? And she said, nope. And I said, please tell me why you would choose in the 8th grade to have a goal of having 2 kids and not be married. She said, because if I'm married to him, I can't collect child support. And then she said, why should I marry a man that I have kids by? He might have issues or something. He might be on drugs. And I said, well, if he's too bad to be your husband, do you really think he's going to make a better father?
So what am I saying? We have a practice in our community, in the Black community most particularly, whether we're talking about, individual relationships, even hearing it from kids who haven't even had one yet, where they're already planning to mimic what they've seen in mothers, grandmothers, aunts, cousins, where Black men are resources for sperm and maybe child support on the back end. Is it truly a surprise when we transition into everything from nonprofit work to activism let alone in terms of formal professional employment, where in Black circles, Black men find themselves on the lower end of the totem pole. Is there no relationship between each of those? See, this is why we talk about the gynocracy. This is why we talk about the one-way contempt for Black men embedded in much of African American culture, to the point where even among the quote-unquote good ones, you still find a degree of contempt that you can't explain, a degree of hostility, a degree of entitlement that in many ways is not her individual fault. It's not something she woke up and decided. It's something that I argue has been passed down. It is accepted practice. You want to actually test that? Go to a family reunion or a family event and wait for your woman to bring you a plate. Or better yet, ask her to. And do it loud enough for the other members to hear. Tell me what you hear as the response. And let me know if you think that an antipathy for Black men exists. Anyway, y'all have a good one. Talk to y'all soon. Enjoy your weekend. Peace, brother.